So this is the second video in our series on topic 4.2, where we're looking at the causes and events of exploration. This is part two, and this focuses on the effects, which is the rise and the establishment of maritime empires. So ultimately, what we need to know from this video is how maritime empires were built. So the very first thing we have to do is kind of set the stage by defining what exactly is a maritime empire and explain the steps in building them. In later videos, we're going to take specific looks at how other states and empires built their maritime empires. So we begin with a review. What exactly is an empire? 1450 to 1750 is the age of empires. And the empires, both land and maritime, are larger political units in which a strong core state conquers and rules surrounding areas and maintains order of their diverse populations over distance through a variety of ways. Ultimately, what they do is they unify, rule, and provide for their populations. Now, remember, these empires are much larger than the smaller states we saw in the global tapestry, and their populations are very diverse. So in Unit 3, we talked about all about the land empires, which is empires like the Ottomans, the Mughals. And we saw that they unified through religion, that they ruled through a professional bureaucracy and a professional military. But what we're going to see is that maritime empires, they're a little bit different. They're a little bit more expensive. And ultimately, they're going to be more successful. So, why are empires built? Well, there's always economic reasons. We conquer areas and expand. We consolidate our power, which means we centralize it. We create administration. We get into conflicts and then we collapse. So they're always made for economic reasons. Land empires are created because of the power vacuum that was left from, the Black Death. When you look at the Ottomans, they took over the Byzantines and the areas that the Mongols had ruled. Same thing with the Safavids. Same thing with the Mughals. But what's happening is they're moving to areas where they can produce things. Now, maritime empires, they're very similar. So this is our working definition of a maritime empire. This is a large political unit in which a core state, which we're going to call a mother country, controls land possessions in other areas of the world. And they unify, rule, and provide through, political, economic, and cultural systems that establishes control of a very diverse population. So it says right there, it uses political, economic, and cultural systems to establish imperial control of culturally and ethnically different population. That's just the extreme diversity. And again, we're referring to unify, rule, and provide. Now, here's the big differences. They are linked by sea routes. So, when we talk about the how, a land empire uses gunpowder weapons, especially cannons. A maritime empire is going to rely upon maritime technology. So, there's two types of empires that we're seeing built. We see trading post empires, which consists of forts located in key entry pot cities in the Eastern Hemisphere. The goal of these types of empires was to essentially control trade. We also see colonial empires, where countries establish colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and their goal is to not only find gold and silver, but also grow commodities to sell, grow cash crops. So what we see here is this is going on at the same time as land empires are developing. But these are different because, first of all, these are very diverse. You still have the core country, but we're going to call it a mother country. And when we get to mercantilism, that'll make more sense. That these populations were much more diverse. So they require a little bit different policies and processes and institutions to unify legitimize, rule, and provide for. But they're made for economic reasons. A trading post, which is focused in the Eastern Hemisphere, is made to control trade for existing commodities such as spices, slaves, cotton, pepper, tea, porcelain, silk. Whereas a colonial empire, which is in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, they were first created to find gold and silver, though the Spanish were the only ones that found it. So what happens is they grow cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar. So ultimately, these are going to be made for economic reasons. So why did nations of Europe begin to build maritime empires? Well, politically, that was their power. Because of mercantilism, their power among other states was measured in how much gold and silver they had. And the more land they had, the more gold and silver they had. And then economically, well, we talked about that in the last video. To solve the gold famine, to bring gold, to legitimize their states, to centralize their power, to create a market economy, they basically had to find direct trade routes to Asia. So essentially, how does the European state gain wealth from an empire? If it's economic reasons, well, it's all about gold and silver. And the main thing that I want you to understand about this is gold and silver not only equals wealth, it also equals power. So, what these states are doing is they're creating these huge empires to be able to bring in gold and silver because it provides the wealth that they need to create a market economy, to legitimize, to centralize, and to make their people happy. But also, the amount of gold and silver that they have makes them powerful. So today we measure power of a military, military powers. Let's say nuclear weapon and the size of your armies and how many planes you have. Well, military power would equal power in today. But back then it didn't matter how many ships you had or anything like that. Your power as a nation was determined by how much gold and silver you had, because it not only equaled the wealth needed to solve the gold famine, but power. So, how do we get power from this empires? Well, we find it. That picture is the world's largest silver deposit. It's a mountain called Potosi in the Americas. Well, when the Spanish found it, they hit pay dirt. So, all the other states are looking for sources of gold and silver that they could find. This would bring in wealth and make them powerful. The middle one would be growing and controlling some sort of economy. The Portuguese, like I discussed in the last video, became very wealthy because they were the first slave traders. And though that's very bad, the reason why they were doing it is they could sell it to bring in gold and silver to provide the wealth to solve the gold famine and become powerful. Later, we see the development of sugar plantations, and that becomes the big thing because every nation had sugar plantations. Essentially, what happens is they come up and they do this. And then finally, is controlling trade. Controlling trade, especially to existing markets in India, Southeast Asia, and China, would allow them to collect all the profits, bringing in wealth in the form of gold and silver and making them powerful. So, how are they built? We begin with the motives and technology, like we've talked about. Every state is being driven by the gold famine, and so they're developing technology. The Portuguese were first through the work of Prince Henry, but the Spanish quickly copied them. And then later, the French, the British, and the Dutch took the technology that the Spanish and the Portuguese used and made their own, especially the flute. Then we send out explorers and we send out conquistadors, people who conquer and establish presences. If you remember in your reading, these are people like the Portuguese Alphonse de Albuquerque that conquered and created forts across the Indian Ocean system. This is also people like the Spanish Pizarro and Cortez, who essentially conquered the Aztecs and the Incas. Then we establish a presence, either a trading post in the Eastern Hemisphere or a colony in the Western Hemisphere. And we create a system to unify the people who live there, to rule them, but especially integrate them into our economy because we want them to bring us gold and silver. In a colony, we also have to move people there. So through that process, we create an official European settlement. So how do we build maritime empires? We have the motive of the gold famine, we get the maritime technology, we send out explorers, we establish a presence, a trading post or a colony, we come up with ways to govern and economics, and then finally we have a settlement. So, who built maritime empires? Where did they build it? How did they gain wealth from their empires? Well, when we look at this big map, what we're looking at is the same five. Portugal and Spain were the first wave, which takes place between 1450 and 1600. And then starting in 1600, the French, the Dutch, and the English built theirs. Notice in the Eastern Hemisphere, which is Africa, Middle East, Asia, China, India, we see a great deal of trading posts. But in the Western Hemisphere, we see colonies. So, key takeaways. Okay. One, both political and economic factors led to European states sponsoring maritime exploration and building maritime empires. On the political side, we see that the amount of land and especially the amount of gold and silver they had determined their power. Economically, well, they were trying to solve the gold famine. They needed money in the form of gold and silver to create their market economy, legitimize their government, to centralize their power, and to make their people happy. All right, so this brings us to the end of this video. In our next video, we're going to look at the first two maritime empire builders, Portugal and Spain, in the Southern Wave.